Claire thought it was just another quiet night at the Maple Pines Inn. The hum of coffee pots, the whisper of wind against the windows. But then the security monitor blinked, and a bloodied bobcat appeared in the side hall, a steel trap biting into its paw, eyes burning with fury and despair. So Claire stood frozen, her heart pounding, until one choice cut through the fear. She would not turn away. That moment, one woman, one wild creature, both trapped in their own cages, would ignite a story of survival,
Hello,
courage,
I need to
and a
report
second
something
chance that
urgent.
changed them forever. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below, and if this story grips your heart, like and subscribe for more true stories of love, courage, and hope. By the time the maples along Route 17 turned the color of a slow-burning ember, Claire had learned every nighttime sound the Maple Pines Inn could make. The old wooden place breathed like a living thing, radiators ticking, roof joists giving soft little groans as the temperature fell, the faint hiss where the front door's weather strip failed to keep out a hairline of cold. From the front desk, she could see the glass vestibule, and beyond that, the tree line. A dense, dark seam where the forest pushed its shoulder against town and refused to budge. Sometimes, the wildest things enter our lives when we least expect them. She wrote it in her journal, half a first line, half a dare, with a coffee ring haloing the margin. It was the kind of sentence she used to text to herself during college workshops in Burlington, when she believed good lines could change the trajectory of a life. Now they were anchor lines, ways to keep herself from drifting during the long, cold hours between the last check-in and the first hint of dawn. The inn at night had its rituals. Claire brewed one final pot of coffee for the stragglers and covered the muffins with a dish towel that smelled faintly of lemon. She did the drawer tally, slid a sticky note under the register for the morning crew. Room 5 needs extra blankets, touring couple from Ohio. Then stood in the vestibule a moment longer than necessary, nose to the glass, breath fogging a little circle on the pane. The tree line was only 30 yards away, but it might as well have been a continent. Maple leaves drifted down in a slow, deliberate fall, like notes you could almost hear. If you've ever worked a graveyard shift, you know how a place learns you, how doors start to whisper instead of slam, how light pools in the exact corners where you need it. Where were you when a quiet room first felt like it had a pulse? Behind her, the lobby lamp buzzed once and steadied. A pair of hiking poles leaned against the rack by the brochures, Green Mountain Trail maps, Sugar House tours, a postcard that looked like it had been printed in 1988, advertising a world's best pancakes breakfast 2 towns over. A snow shovel stood sentry beside the coat tree, even though the first real storm was weeks away. Vermonters prepared by muscle memory. On nights like this, Claire liked to step outside with the compost pail from the kitchen, use it as an excuse to breathe the air, and remind herself there was a world beyond counters and key envelopes. The concrete stoop radiated the day's leftover warmth, but the yard carried the first bite of winter under the damp. Somewhere a chain clinked, one of the gutter downspouts probably, or the kitchen screen door settling on its hinges. She set the pail by the bin, lifted the lid, and paused. The forest smelled like leaf litter and iron. Not the scent of blood exactly, just a metallic edge underneath the rot, a mineral cord at the back of the nose. She told herself not to be melodramatic. A mouse nesting near the dumpster, a fox passing through. The edge of town made room for that kind of traffic. Still, when she turned back toward the vestibule, the lobby's aquarium glow felt farther away than it should. The camera monitor above the desk showed its usual grid. Parking lot empty except for the shuttle van, side hall quiet, rear delivery entrance clear. The images had that washed-out look surveillance footage always has, colors reduced to a tired palette. Sometimes the system threw false motion alerts when wind shoved the maples too hard. Sometimes it went half snowy for a heartbeat, then snapped back in, like the inn was blinking. She added that to her journal. Inn blinks like a tired animal, and smiled at herself for the comparison. You're reaching, she wrote beneath it. And then, beneath that, reach anyway. Most of her pages were a conversation like that. Kid you calling grown you forward, grown you pretending not to be scared of how much she still wanted things. A book with her name on the spine. A life bigger than front desk smiles and towel inventory counts. People assumed quiet meant boredom. It didn't. Quiet meant you heard everything. The zipper of a coat in the stairwell, the soft thump of a late-arriving boot on the runner, the far-off freight train that only came through after midnight, when its horn felt like another moon rising. She loved that part. The world rearranging itself with a sound. Loved that it meant the mountains were still threaded to other places. At 12:43, a guest from room 7 wandered down for tea in a robe the color of old snow. He apologized for the noise he wasn't making, stirred a chamomile bag in a paper cup without speaking, and padded back upstairs. Claire washed the spoon and thought about how loneliness was louder in public, a sound you swallowed because you didn't want to bother anyone. In the window's reflection, she saw her own face and, just behind it, the tree line's dark, stitched edge, as if the woods had come inside and were trying on the shape of her life. A moth threw itself against the vestibule light and fell out of frame. When Claire went to sweep it gently into her palm, it righted itself, clung to the glass, and beat its powdery wings in slow, defiant pulses. "You'll make it?" she whispered. Not because the moth could hear, but because saying it out loud made it truer for both of them. She cupped the lock with her other hand, felt the seam of cold air, and imagined winter pushing its face against the same glass, patient and inevitable. Have you ever had a season nudge the door and ask to come in? If tonight were yours, what would you let cross the threshold? On her break, she stepped into the kitchen and let the soft hum of the walk-in fill the space behind her ribs. She cut an apple and ate it over the sink, watching her reflection ripple in the black window. Outside, the tree line held steady. Somewhere up the road, a dog barked, a quick, clipped alarm, and then nothing. She licked juice from her wrist and felt suddenly, absurdly protective of the inn. The way you feel when you come home and realize you're the only one who will notice if something's out of place. By the time she returned to the desk, the coffee had gone bitter. She poured a fresh pot anyway. It wasn't about taste so much as the ritual. Hot steam, the hiss, the hope. She pulled the receipts to reconcile and lined up the pens by color. Blue, then black, then the single red one she never used unless something went very wrong. Across the lobby, the brochure rack tilted a degree to the left, as if the whole town's ideas about itself were leaning. It made her laugh out loud, unexpectedly bright in the hush. Then the monitor blinked. Not the full snowstorm static, just a stutter, a half-second hitch in the feed that made the side hall camera smear the image before sharpening. Claire straightened the way you do when somebody says your name from another room. The grid steadied. Nothing out of place. The tree line, a dark shoulder. The parking lot, an empty stage. She breathed out and wrote one more line in the journal, underlining it twice without meaning to. Be ready. Outside, a wind came off the ridge and carried a single maple leaf sideways, smacking it against the vestibule glass where it stuck for a long breath, red and veined like a warning, like a blessing, like both at once. And Claire, who had come to this job for the paycheck and stayed for reasons she couldn't explain, pressed her palm to the glass as if she could feel the forest's pulse through it, as if, beyond the dark seam where trees met town, something had already started moving toward her. The first shrill beep cracked through the stillness like glass under pressure. Claire flinched, coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug, her heart vaulting into her throat. The security monitor above the desk had gone from static calm to a flashing red alert in the side hall camera. She wiped her hand quickly on her jeans, convinced it was just another glitch, another maple branch triggering the sensor. But when the feed sharpened, her stomach dropped. A shape staggered into the frame, low and heavy, moving with a painful lurch. Not human. Not a stray dog either. Under the hallway's sterile fluorescent light, she saw fur, tawny, dappled with dark rosettes. And then the raw, terrible truth. A steel trap biting cruelly into the animal's front paw. Blood marked the floor behind it in broken commas. It was a bobcat. The animal's head lifted. Even through the pixel grain of the monitor, Claire felt the heat of its gaze. Wild amber eyes lit with both fury and despair. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had only seen bobcats from a distance, shadows cutting across the tree line at dusk. Rumors whispered by locals who swore they heard screams like a woman crying in the woods. Never like this. Never bleeding, cornered inside her inn. The bobcat stumbled forward, sides heaving. Its muscles quivered beneath the matted fur, every step a gamble between collapse and defiance. Then, as if the camera lens itself had drawn its attention, the animal froze. Eyes locked straight ahead, eyes that seemed to strip her bare. Claire's hands shook so violently, the mug slipped, shattering against the linoleum. She pressed a palm to her chest, the thundering inside her ribcage nearly deafening. Run? Call for help? But her legs wouldn't move. Something in those wild eyes anchored her. The loneliness there. The rage at being trapped, the refusal to bow. It was a mirror she hadn't expected, a reflection of her own caged restlessness, her own bruised dreams of freedom. The bobcat swayed, lips curling back in a low snarl that echoed faintly down the side hall. Claire could almost taste the fear rising in her throat, but something else grew with it. An ache. Sharp and undeniable. She whispered, barely aware her lips were moving. God, you're beautiful, and you don't deserve this. The animal's paw slipped, claws scraping tile. It collapsed against the wall, sides heaving with exhaustion. The trap's rusted metal teeth glinted under the hall light, biting deep into flesh. Claire's instinct screamed danger. But another voice, quieter, steadier, pushed back. If you turn away now, this creature dies here, alone. She hovered by the desk, fingers trembling over the phone. Call animal control? Wildlife rescue? Would anyone arrive in time? Her reflection in the dark glass looked back at her, wide-eyed and pale, as if asking, what do you choose? The bobcat's gaze softened. Not submission, not trust, but something raw. Recognition, maybe. The wild and the human both trapped, both aching for release. And for the first time since she'd taken the night shift at Maple Pines, Claire felt the edges of her life tilt, as though the forest itself had pushed through the door and demanded to be heard. The alarm light still pulsed. The monitor still held that image. Blood, steel, defiance. Claire set her jaw, lifted the receiver, and dialed with steady fingers. Somewhere deep in her chest, the sentence she'd written hours earlier returned to her, no longer an idle line in her journal, but a prophecy whispering itself alive. Sometimes, the wildest things enter our lives when we least expect them. The receiver clicked against Claire's ear, the automated line buzzing before transferring her to the Vermont Wildlife Rescue Center. But the wait tone barely registered. Every part of her awareness was locked on the monitor. The Bobcat hadn't moved far. It lay slumped against the wall, chest pumping like bellows. Every rise of its ribs looked like a battle it might lose. The steel trap's cruel bite shone under the fluorescent light, and Claire had to fight the instinct to run, because running meant leaving it to die. "Wildlife rescue," a woman's voice answered. Claire whispered too quickly, stumbling over words. "There's a bobcat inside the Maple Pines Inn. Side hall camera. It's hurt. Badly. A steel trap on its paw. Please, it's bleeding." The dispatcher's calm cut through her panic. "Stay where you are. Keep all guests away. Help is on the way." Claire hung up, her breath ragged, and turned slowly toward the hall itself. Every instinct told her not to go closer, but she couldn't just stand behind glass, watching. She eased out from behind the desk, every footstep on the old wood sounding louder than thunder. The bobcat's ears flicked. Its eyes burned through the dim hallway, pinning her in place. A low growl rumbled out, deep and warning. Her hands trembled so hard she pressed them together to stop the shaking. "Hey," she whispered, voice barely carrying. "I'm not here to hurt you." The bobcat's lip curled, showing teeth sharp as broken glass. For a split second, Claire's body screamed to retreat. But she forced herself to stay, heart hammering so violently she thought it might echo down the corridor. Instead of panic, she leaned into the stillness. She spoke as though she were addressing a lost traveler, her words soft, uneven, but steady enough to carry. "You didn't ask for this, did you? You just wanted to run free." The animal's growl didn't vanish, but it shifted. Less fury, more exhaustion. Its eyes, still hard with pain, seemed to narrow on her voice. Claire moved with care, not toward it, but around, pulling a side door closed with her foot, gently latching another behind her. Her breaths synced with her movements, slow, deliberate, creating a pocket that kept the bobcat contained, safe from stumbling into the lobby where guests might appear. Each door clicked like a chess move, sealing spaces without trapping the creature in further terror. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her voice, surprisingly, remained low and even. "You're strong," she murmured, "stronger than anyone knew. Hold on just a little longer." On the desk monitor, her image looked almost surreal. A young woman, trembling hands, stepping with cautious intention. The wildcat crouched just feet away, its paw dripping red onto pale tile. The camera recorded it all. The steady rhythm of her voice, the way her shoulders stayed squared, though her body wanted to fold in fear, the defiant fire in the bobcat's eyes, and the matching flicker in her own. Minutes dragged like hours. Outside, the wind pushed against the inn's walls. Inside, two beings, one human, one wild, waited in fragile, impossible stillness. Claire swallowed, daring a whisper she hadn't meant to say out loud. "I see you." And though the bobcat couldn't possibly understand, something in its gaze shifted again, not softer, not safe, but aware. She kept her distance, her breath measured, until the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached her ears, headlights sweeping across the lobby window. Rescue had arrived. Still, Claire didn't move, didn't break the moment. She stayed rooted, heart thundering, voice soft and steady in the hallway shadows, because in those amber eyes, furious, untamed, alive, she had seen something she recognized too well: the raw ache of being trapped and the stubborn will to keep fighting anyway. The rumble of tires faded into the gravel lot outside, headlights sweeping across the lobby's glass like a signal flare. Claire exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. She had been standing in that narrow corridor, the Bobcat's gaze searing into hers, afraid that the wrong sound or twitch might send the wounded animal lunging or collapsing. The side door burst open. A tall man in a heavy jacket stepped through first, moving with the clipped precision of someone who had lived his life in tense moments. His hair was cut close, a pale scar running from his temple to his jaw. Behind him came a woman with a veterinarian's kit slung across her shoulder, her dark braids swinging as she hurried forward. "Rescue team, don't move closer," the man ordered in a low, controlled voice. His eyes flicked to Claire, registering her pale face and trembling hands, then shifted immediately to the Bobcat. The animal, already on the edge, let out a guttural snarl, ears flattening, body hunched low. Blood smeared across the tile where it shifted its weight, the steel trap still clamped viciously to its paw. The woman, Marissa, as Claire would learn, knelt and unlatched her case, pulling out a tranquilizer syringe. "He's bleeding out faster than I like," she muttered. "We need to sedate and remove the trap before shock sets in." The man, Ethan, took a step forward, careful, deliberate. His voice carried the calm authority of someone used to danger. "Easy, big guy," he murmured, eyes fixed on the Bobcat. Then, without turning, he said to Claire, "You've done well. Back up slowly now." Claire obeyed, her legs rubber beneath her. She pressed her back to the wall, watching as Marissa raised the syringe gun. The Bobcat bared its teeth, eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to flare brighter at the scent of strangers. For a heartbeat, Claire thought it might launch itself forward despite the injury. But when Marissa fired, the dart buried itself in the muscle of the cat's flank. The animal let out a rasping snarl, staggered, then collapsed with a heavy, reluctant grace onto the blood-marked tile. Marissa and Ethan moved quickly. Bolt cutters clanged as Ethan severed the rusted steel jaws, freeing the mangled paw. Marissa's gloved hands were efficient, swabbing, suturing, sliding an IV line with the calm of someone who'd seen too many emergencies. Still, even she winced at the depth of the wound. Claire found herself frozen, clutching her journal so tightly the spine dug into her palm. Her instinct was to step forward, to comfort, to apologize to the creature whose pain filled the room. But Ethan's words cut across the silence. "This species can never be tamed," he said, his tone sharp, almost like a warning aimed at her directly. "Don't get too attached. Bobcats aren't pets. They don't bond. They survive." The statement struck her harder than she expected. She hugged the journal closer, the ink inside still wet from her frantic notes earlier, as if recording every detail might preserve the strange connection she had felt in those wild eyes. Marissa glanced up briefly, her tone softer. "He's young, maybe 2 years old, strong. If infection doesn't set in, he's got a fighting chance." Claire's breath trembled out. She lowered her gaze to the Bobcat's still form, tranquilized, stitched, breathing shallow but steady. Even sedated, its body radiated defiance, the pride of a creature born to roam ridgelines and shadows, not lie under fluorescent lights. She wanted to speak, to defend what she had felt in that brief, impossible exchange in the hall. But the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she scribbled into the margin of her journal, her pen scratching so fast the lines slanted. Some spirits carry entire forests in their eyes. You don't tame that. You honor it. Ethan and Marissa lifted the bobcat onto a stretcher, wrapping its injured paw in gauze. As they carried it out, Claire followed to the doorway, the autumn wind sweeping through, carrying the iron scent of blood and the resin of pine. She said nothing, but her silence was not agreement. It was a vow, unspoken yet clear even to herself. She would not look away, not let this encounter fade into the blur of another night shift. And as the taillights vanished into the Vermont dark, Claire held her journal tight, afraid that if she loosened her grip, the memory of those blazing eyes might slip away forever. The world beyond the inn blurred into routine again. Check-ins, folded towels, coffee brewing. But for Claire, everything had shifted. She carried the image of the stretcher, the bloodied paw wrapped in gauze, the wild eyes half closed under sedation. When Ethan and Marissa left, she wanted to follow. Days later, she finally did. At the Vermont Wildlife Rescue Center, the building smelled of antiseptic and hay, the faint musk of animals carried in on the wind. A volunteer led her down a narrow hall where doors were marked with laminated tags: fox, hawk, owl. Then, lynx rufus, male. Inside, the bobcat lay in a crate lined with blankets. His fur had been cleaned, though traces of dried blood clung around the bandages on his foreleg. An IV line trailed to a bag above, delivering fluids with a steady drip. His flank rose and fell, shallow but determined. "They've given him a name," Marissa said, appearing at Claire's side. "Rowan. Strong trees bend, but don't break." Claire whispered the name to herself, tasting it like something sacred. Rowan. The paradox of it struck her. A creature designed for freedom, forced to survive through human hands. The trap had taken more than flesh. It had stolen the rhythm of the wild from his stride. Now survival meant stitches, antibiotics, measured feedings. Every step back toward the forest began here, inside walls that smelled of bleach. Claire visited as often as her shifts allowed. She'd stand quietly, journal pressed to her chest, watching Rowan's ears flick toward every sound. Some days he hissed at the slightest movement. Others he lay still, conserving strength. His paw was sutured with careful precision, but infection threatened, swelling red around the wound. Each night she scribbled reflections. Sometimes freedom must pass through the hands of kindness before it can be found again. Ethan didn't hide his disapproval. When he caught her near the enclosure, he shook his head. "You care too much," he said. "If you start believing he needs you, you'll forget what he really needs: the wild." His words carried the weight of warning, yet she couldn't look away. She remembered the night in the hallway, the eyes blazing through pain, yet refusing to yield. That defiance lived in her still, echoing through her own unspoken longings. Weeks passed. Rowan's fur regained its sheen. The hollow spaces in his cheeks began to fill. He snarled when the staff approached, strength returning in each flash of teeth, each lash of his tail. And yet, when Claire's voice drifted into the room, something shifted. He would pause, ears tilted forward, as if her words, though meaningless to him, carried a rhythm he recognized. One evening, Claire stood outside the crate, Marissa beside her, recording vitals. Rowan lifted his head, amber eyes piercing through the dim. For the briefest moment, Claire thought she saw it again. That reflection of loneliness, that tether that stretched between them. She almost reached for the bars, then caught herself, hands curling back around her journal. Marissa noticed. "It's not foolish," she said quietly. "Sometimes they see more than we think." The truth weighed heavy. Rowan's recovery was a fragile bridge, a liminal place between death and freedom. And Claire, caught in her own restless life, felt that bridge beneath her feet too. Back at the inn, she wrote by lamplight, her words carrying both Rowan's fight and her own. "We heal in captivity, but we are not meant to stay there. The test of love is whether you can let go when the wild calls again." And though she didn't know it yet, that test was coming faster than she imagined. By December, the snow in Vermont had hardened into a crust that crunched beneath every step. Rowan no longer belonged in a crate under fluorescent lights. His body had outgrown the narrow recovery ward. When Claire arrived at the Wildlife Rescue Center that morning, she found Marissa waiting by the door, heavy parka dusted with frost. "He's ready," Marissa said simply. They led Claire to the new enclosure, several acres of fenced woodland, dense with spruce and maples. Snow draped the branches like white fire, muffling the sounds of the world. Here Rowan could learn to be what he had almost forgotten: wild. When they opened the transport crate, the Bobcat didn't bolt. He crouched low, ears twitching, nostrils flaring at the scent of open air. Then, with a sudden burst, he leapt into the snow. His paws sank deep, but he moved with power. His bandaged legs stiff yet determined. Watching him disappear between trees, Claire felt a tightness in her chest, equal parts relief and fear. The team installed cameras to monitor him. Claire returned every chance she had, sitting in the observation shed where the heaters hummed softly. She watched Rowan's cautious prowl, the way he stalked the shadows before springing at a hidden target. Sometimes he pounced on snow, ears flattening in frustration when the ground yielded nothing. Other times, he froze at the snap of a branch, amber eyes blazing, every muscle taut. Claire scribbled furiously in her journal. Every twitch, every pause is a rehearsal for freedom. But the wild was not a safe classroom. One afternoon, Rowan scaled a tree to escape a startled crow and slipped, his injured paw striking the trunk with a jarring crack. He yowled, a sound that ripped through the enclosure and straight into Claire's ribs. She clutched the edge of her seat, instinct begging her to run to him. Ethan's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Don't," he said firmly. "If he learns someone will come every time he stumbles, he'll never survive out there." The words stung, but Claire knew he was right. Still, she whispered under her breath, "Hold on, Rowan. You can do this." That night, Rowan limped but pressed forward. His prowl grew sharper, his pounces more precise. He shredded logs with his claws, left scat in marked places, staking claim as though the fence couldn't contain him. The defiance returned, brighter now, raw as fire under ice. And Claire, watching through the frost-rimmed glass, realized that in those amber eyes, she saw more than survival. She saw untamed pride, a spirit that refused to bend, no matter how the world tried to break it. Yet beneath the triumph lurked a shadow. The town had begun whispering about the Bobcat in their midst. the strange footage from the inn still circulating online. Tourists had started asking for directions to the rescue center. Some locals muttered that Rowan should never leave, that a living mascot could keep Maple Pines on the map. Claire felt the unease coil tighter with each visit. She closed her journal one evening, frost blooming on the shed's window, and pressed her palm against the glass. Rowan moved in the distance, a phantom between trees, ears sharp, body coiled. She could almost imagine the fence vanishing, the horizon opening wide to mountains beyond. Soon, she murmured, though whether to him or to herself she couldn't be sure. Rowan crouched, snow dusting his whiskers, and met her gaze across the expanse. The wind rattled the fence. For one heartbeat, it was as if the barrier didn't exist, as if both of them were staring into the same truth. Freedom demanded risk, and captivity, no matter how kind, was still a cage. By the time the New Year's lights dimmed in the town square, Rowan had become more than a wildcat in recovery. He had become a spectacle. The leaked hotel footage, grainy but gripping, had spread online like wildfire. Tourists watched it on their phones at the diner, replaying the moment Claire's trembling voice calmed the bloodied animal in the hallway. Hashtags surfaced. The Maple Pines Bobcat became a phrase that even city newspapers picked up. At first, Claire thought the attention might help. Awareness could mean more donations for the rescue center, more compassion for wild animals. But quickly, the tone in town shifted. On a bitter January evening, she overheard two men arguing outside the inn while loading firewood into their truck. Why release him? Folks would drive hours to see that cat. We could build a little exhibit, sell tickets. Maple Pines needs the money. And what? Cage him like some circus act? He belongs in the mountains. Their voices carried the sharp edge of division, and Claire's stomach knotted. Inside the inn, guests whispered about Rowan the way children speak of folk legends. One woman leaned over the counter, eyes wide with excitement. "You were the girl in the video, weren't you? Do you think he'd let me see him up close?" Claire forced a polite smile, but her hand tightened on the pen. She wanted to scream, "He's not yours to see. He's not mine either." At the rescue center, the debate was fiercer. Ethan stood before a small group of volunteers one night, his stance rigid. If public pressure wins, Rowan may never be released. Some board members are already listening to the town council. Claire's pulse raced. That would destroy him. You've seen his eyes. He's not meant for cages. Ethan met her gaze, his own hard with experience. And you think people care about what's meant? They care about what brings them profit or pride. Marissa tried to mediate, but the lines had already been drawn. Flyers circulated, some urging Rowan's release, others petitioning to keep him as a permanent attraction. Claire filled pages of her journal with furious ink. Freedom isn't a souvenir. You don't pin it down for the sake of postcards and hotel bookings. Yet her words felt fragile against the tide of voices swelling louder each day. One evening she returned to the enclosure, snowflakes clinging to her hair. Rowan prowled along the fence line, his coat glinting under the floodlights. His paw, though scarred, carried him with strength now, no trace of the limp. He stopped suddenly, head turning, amber eyes locking onto hers through the mesh. In that gaze, Claire felt the question sharpen like ice. Will you fight for my freedom, even if it means losing me? Her throat tightened. For months, Rowan had been her mirror, her companion in solitude, her reminder that even wounded things could find their wildness again. To let him go meant facing emptiness. To keep him meant betraying everything she had seen in his spirit. The wind cut through her coat, bitter and unrelenting, but she stood rooted, whispering into the night. I'll choose you, Rowan. Not the version they want. Not the one I wish I could keep. The real you. Free. Behind her, the town's arguments rumbled on. Petitions gathered signatures, and cameras hovered at the fence like vultures. But in that frozen moment, Claire made her choice. And choices, she knew, always carried a cost. The storm arrived without warning, a wall of white fury crashing over the green mountains. By dusk, the wind howled like 1,000 voices through the pines, and snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond the inn's windows. The power flickered once, twice, then vanished, plunging the building into silence broken only by the roar outside. Claire's phone buzzed with a single message from Marissa. Rowan's enclosure system's down. We need hands. She didn't hesitate. Pulling on her boots and parka, she braved the blizzard, headlights barely cutting through the veil of snow. Branches snapped overhead like gunfire. The roads disappeared under drifts, but instinct pulled her toward the rescue center. When she arrived, the compound was half buried, floodlights dark, generators sputtering. Ethan was already there, his face carved with urgency as he wrestled with a fuel line. His heating grid's out, he shouted over the wind. If he panics, he'll rip those stitches wide open. The enclosure loomed, a cage of shadows under the storm's assault. Inside, Rowan was a blur of frantic movement. He slammed against the fencing, eyes wide with terror, breath exploding in white plumes. The wind rattled the chain links like cruel laughter. Claire pressed to the fence, her heart shattering at the sight. Every ounce of progress, the healing, the regained strength, was unraveling in his fear. She could see the fresh bloom of blood at his paw, where he had torn the half-healed wound open. Stay back, Ethan warned. He's unpredictable, but Claire was already moving. Not closer to the gate, but to the narrow shelter where volunteers stored supplies. She grabbed her journal, fingers numb, pages damp from melted snow. She knew Rowan couldn't understand words, but maybe he could understand something deeper. Standing just beyond the cage, her voice trembling in the gale, she began to read. Not the words themselves, her voice was too ragged, the wind stealing half of them, but the rhythm. The steady cadence she had once used to calm herself on sleepless nights at the inn. Her voice wove through the storm, soft but unyielding. Rowan froze mid-panic, chest heaving. His ears twitched toward her, eyes locking on the sound. The wind still screamed, snow still battered the fence, but the wild cat stood still for the first time in minutes, sides quivering with something that wasn't just fear anymore. Claire turned the page, her hands shaking, and kept reading. The words blurred in the snowlight, but her tone carried. Calm, even, alive. Ethan watched from the shadows, disbelief etched on his face. Rowan lowered himself slowly into the snow, blood staining white beneath him. His amber eyes never left Claire, the frenzy fading into a fragile stillness. She swallowed hard, her throat raw, and whispered between lines, "You're not alone. Not tonight." For a moment, the storm itself seemed to pause. The world narrowed to the glow of her breath, the scratch of paper, the steady pulse of trust bridging the divide between cage and human. Ethan stepped closer, softer now. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Claire didn't stop until the generators roared back to life, the floodlights flaring and the heaters humming again. Only then did she close the journal, tears frozen on her cheeks. Rowan blinked once, slowly, then turned his head, pressing his injured paw gently into the snow, as if to ground himself. In that fragile, impossible silence, Claire understood. True connection wasn't written in words or bound in cages. It lived in trust. Raw, dangerous, unexplainable trust. And it was trust that had saved them both. By the time the snow softened into spring melt, Rowan was no longer the shattered creature Claire had first seen staggering into the inn's hallway. His coat gleamed with health, the scar on his paw a thin, defiant line of survival. He paced the edge of the enclosure with restless energy, every movement sharper, hungrier, as if the mountains beyond the fence were calling him home. The decision came at last. Ethan delivered it bluntly, arms folded against the thawing wind. "He's ready. Tomorrow we release him at the ridgeline near Green Mountain." Claire's throat tightened. She had known this moment would come, had written pages about it in her journal, but the finality still struck like a blow. She nodded, forcing her voice steady. "That's where he belongs." The next morning dawned clear, the snow retreating into patches of glassy ice. Volunteers gathered at the release site, a narrow forest road that ended where wilderness began. The Green Mountains loomed ahead, ridges softened by fog, spruce trees whispering in the wind. Rowan's crate was lifted from the transport truck, heavy with tension. Inside he growled low, the sound vibrating through the wood. His eyes glinted through the slats, feral and unyielding. Claire stood back, clutching her journal so tightly her knuckles ached. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, but already the sting was behind her eyes. Marissa squeezed her shoulder. "This is the best part. Hard, but right." Ethan unlatched the crate. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Rowan exploded out, muscles surging, paws tearing through the last of the snow. He bolted across the clearing without hesitation, a blur of strength and grace, vanishing into the tree line. Claire's chest hollowed at the sudden emptiness. She wanted him to look back, to glance once over his shoulder, to acknowledge what had bound them for those months. But Rowan did not. His body melted into the forest, leaving behind only paw prints pressed into thawing snow, already softening at the edges. The others murmured relief, some even cheered, but Claire remained still. The silence he left behind roared louder than any storm. She pressed her palm against her journal, whispering words no one else could hear. "Be free. Even if it means I lose you." A crow took flight above the ridge, its wings black against the sky, as if punctuating the moment. On the drive back, Claire sat in silence. Ethan glanced at her in the mirror once, his voice quiet. "You did right. He's where he was meant to be." Claire nodded, though her heart ached. At the inn that night, she opened her journal, pages rippling in the lamplight. She wrote carefully, as if each word were a thread binding her to memory. Some bonds aren't measured by how long they last, but by how deeply they change you. Rowan didn't need to look back. The wild doesn't owe us that. She set down her pen, gazed out at the tree line beyond the glass. For the first time since she'd started working nights, she no longer felt the forest was pressing in. Instead, it felt vast, endless, a horizon Rowan now roamed freely. Still, she couldn't help but wonder, would the silence always ache this much? Or would it one day feel like proof that somewhere in the darkness, Rowan's paws carried him farther than cages or walls could ever hold. Life at the Maple Pines Inn returned to its quiet rhythm. Coffee brewing at dawn, tourists flipping through brochures, the creak of stairs that Claire knew by heart. Yet for her, the silence was never the same. The woods outside no longer felt like a barrier pressing in, but like an open door. Somewhere beyond those trees, Rowan prowled freely, leaving ghost paw prints across her imagination. The town, however, hadn't let him go so easily. Articles spread across regional papers, then national outlets. "The Bobcat who survived the trap," one headline read. Others framed it as "the girl who calmed the wild." Tourists arrived asking questions, snapping photos by the tree line, wanting a glimpse of the inn that had appeared in the viral video. What surprised Claire most was not the fame, but the conversations Rowan sparked. At the diner, old loggers debated the ethics of trapping. Teachers brought school children on nature walks, speaking of predators as protectors of balance rather than threats. The town council, once torn, began discussing conservation funds for the first time in decades. A single animal had become a mirror, forcing the town to see itself, what it valued, what it feared losing. Claire carried her journal everywhere, its pages now heavy with more than private thoughts. They were filled with sketches of Rowan, fragments of dialogue she remembered from nights at the rescue center, passages she hoped to shape into essays. She wasn't ready to call herself a writer yet, but for the first time she believed she could be one. Rowan had given her that, a story too alive to ignore. One evening, weeks after the release, she stepped outside during her shift. The air was sharp with early spring, the maples budding red at their tips. The woods whispered with thawing streams. She pressed her hand against the glass of the vestibule door, just as she had the night Rowan first appeared. "Some guests come only once in a lifetime," she wrote later in her journal, "but they leave behind an entire forest in your heart." Her words no longer felt like an attempt to hold on. They were a way of letting go, of honoring what could not be caged. Now, when guests asked if she believed Rowan still lingered near town, Claire would smile softly and say, "The wild doesn't vanish just because we stop seeing it. It's out there, alive and proud, exactly where it should be." And on quiet nights, when the inn settled into its breathing silence, she would look out across the tree line and imagine the bobcat's amber eyes glinting in the dark, a flash of muscle and spirit slipping through moonlight. She didn't need him to return. Knowing he was free was enough, because Rowan's legacy wasn't only his survival, it was the change he left behind, in the town, in the forests, and most of all, in Claire.